I'm going to start with a specific discussion about what the illustrations to Job were. And I think this is very important to setting the entire um, to set the entire background of why this is important, particularly from a Swedenborgian perspective. So let me see. Now, this is the man of the hour. For those of you who have never seen his image before, this was painted in 1807 when he was 50 by Thomas Phillips. Okay, so this is the image that I was talking about, and this is also there's a very famous book by a man named G.E. Bentley, who was a Blake scholar, and he gave the title "The Stranger from Paradise," and it comes from this particular quote by Blake's wife, Catherine, or Kate, as he called her. I have very little of Mr. Blake's company. He is always in paradise. And you can sort of tell that she's being tongue-in-cheek there, but that really was a lot of their life, is that he spent as much time as he could in what he called the worlds of the spirit and in the eternal world, as he described it. So the book of Job, we're going to be using a lot of pictures that I took myself from the Chicago Art Institute's copy, which is a copy of the last edition from 1825 to 1826. But it's very important to know that that wasn't the entirety of his of the illustrations themselves. In fact, there were 3 sets. And the earliest set, which was given to Thomas Butes, which we'll talk about very soon, was commissioned in 1805. But he actually began drawing what he thought would be the illustrations to the Book of Job in the 1780s. And it's a very significant time because this was the same period that he was being introduced to Swedenborg, that he was making substantial contacts with Swedenborgians, and it's no surprise, at least to me, that Thomas Butes would be the one who requested this first set, because he was a very devout Swedenborgian, and he and Blake discussed this quite intensely. But aside from the Butes set, as I said, it's the earliest. There's 19 engravings for this particular set, but the second set was created for another artist named Linnell, we'll talk about very soon, who's not himself a Swedenborgian, but he was very interested in hearing Blake's interpretation, and he knew several Swedenborgians. And Linnell would also be the person who would encourage the black and white production, which became the most popular and the most widely distributed, and the one that I worked with for this particular talk. So, as I said, Thomas Butes, this is an image of him now. He was born in 1757, the same year that Blake was. He did live quite a bit longer than Blake, almost 20 years. Blake died in 1827, and he lasted to 1845. Blake died in 69 years of age. He was the one who commissioned the first set, which was finally given to him and finalized in the years 1805 to 1806, and we'll look at some images from it very, very soon. As I said, Butes was a very devoted Swedenborgian, and he actually met Blake through other Swedenborgians. We're not entirely sure. I don't, for instance, know that he attended the Great Eastcheap Conference, but I do know that he was a part of Duchesne's group, who, Duchesne, by the way, was the first minister to the Continental Congress, but he was also a Swedenborgian who ran a study group in London, and Butes was an attender of that, as was Blake. And he was the first one who saw Blake's work as a corrective to some of the things that he found in Swedenborg, meaning that he thought that Blake breathed a new life into a lot of the things that Swedenborg had written. And this is very significant because there is this myth that Blake was a radical rejecter of Swedenborg, which I don't share. Blake was a lifetime reader of Swedenborg. I think he he imbibed as much as he could, but he tried to connect Swedenborg's teachings. Well, actually, I would say that many of his most radical ideas have their root in his particular reading of Swedenborg, which is a point that's not often easily agreed to among scholars of Blake. So these original images that we have here, you can see they're obviously watercolors. They are a little bit on the darker side compared to the late 1805 elements, and you can see a lot of Blake's line work here is significantly less precise. And if you notice behind the image here, which is Lucifer going to and fro, you can see two images on both sides, which I think represent male and female angels or spirits. These become much more clarified later on. And I just want to say, as this is an art presentation, we have a lot of images to go through tonight. So get used to all the pretty pictures. And do notice, I'm calling this the divine figure or the angel of the presence, as will become very clear later on. Because Blake is in fact making a profound statement with his illustrations of the Book of Job. And in some ways he's trying to call out what he sees as the cruelty of the deity or the divine actor. So that's why I say divine figure, angel of the presence, but not to confuse it with the Godhead itself, which is a very significant point in the discussion. Here we have Job being covered with boils. The color patterns are consistently less dramatic than we find in the Linnell edition, but it was his first. And then this is an image that we're going to speak about quite a bit. This is the bad dream that Job receives. For some reason I'm blanking on the title. But if you notice here as we look around, this is significantly less developed than his later work. And what's very significant is that basically this project lasted with Blake almost until the very end of his life. And that's why I think that it is so incredibly significant. It was more than half of his life he was engaged with this particular subject, and he was trying to make sense of it in terms of his own poetry and philosophy. Now, this is, of course, my favorite image from the book, from this particular engraving series. I think the blue colors here are the most powerful. This is when the sons of God let forth their joy, the sons of the morning. And I actually had this made into a phone casing, but it's quite powerful, I think. So as I've said, the Buttes edition was the first, but then he also produced two editions, the final edition of 1825, 1826, and another watercolor work for this man. His name was John Linnell. He was a well-known landscape painter in Britain. If you look at the time, he was, a generation younger than Blake and lived considerably older, lived much longer than Blake. Blake, of course, died in 1827. He's almost 30, lived almost 30 years longer. And this was also a fairly typical reality with Blake, because younger painters were often attracted to him. They sort of sought him out, and he was almost a guru figure, but he was also someone who was accessible because of his very limited material success. And actually his wife continued to live. She made, she was protected by some of Blake's followers, who were all artists, and these are called the Shoreham Ancients, because they gathered around Blake to hear his interpretation of Christianity, and very often his interpretation of the works of Swedenborg. As I mentioned, he was himself, John Linnell was not a Swedenborgian. I haven't found his name amongst any Swedenborgian records, but he was around all things Swedenborgian. He attended Theosophical Society meetings. He was he was well known to Charles Augustus Tolk and John Augustus Tolk. He was someone who's very comfortable in that world. And he also was one of Blake's confidants in terms of spirituality from the writings that we have from them. And it's really amazing because although Blake was considerably older, Linnell was in many ways sort of like a father figure to him. And especially later in life, in 1825, when Blake is sort of going through an issue with his lack of financial success, it's really interesting that Linnell, was one of his big encouragers to continue working and to produce these images. Now, as I've said, you can see here, this is from the Linnell work, much clearer use of color, much stronger line definition. These images are night and day from the earlier ones, from the Butte edition. You can see that his ability to cover shading here is quite profound. And although we have some sort of childishness in some of the faces, they are much better defined. And he also has a much broader view of space in this particular design. And I'll show you in a few moments how big they are in relation to human hands. This is, of course, the God answering Job out of the whirlwind, which takes on, as many things do, a very inverted idea in Blake's cosmology. But you see here, again, a very highly defined line work. And this was from an engraving, which means that it is carved into a copper plate and then painted as a secondary act. And really, I think this is perhaps the most masterful he was in a lot of his painted engravings. And now let's go to the 1826 edition. As I've said, this was not a illustrated edition, although it's very clear that he wanted there to be an illustration. He reworked several of the plates that he had, and he created, I think, some of the most powerful engraved art of the period of the early 19th century. And as I've said, if you look at the definition here, it's just really phenomenal how different it works for some of the illuminated versions of this particular series. Shading is very clearly there, it's very apparent, and we will be spending a long time discussing the marginalia that we see all around. This is from the Chicago edition, by the way. And I actually, so I'm not that great at taking photographs. So many of the photographs that I thought would make such good, I thought, oh yeah, well, they'll really appreciate how many of them I took. And then I looked at them and they're horrible. So I used some of mine and a lot from the Blake archive. Here's another, this is of course, oh, sorry. And when I'm trying, at any event, I'll just leave it at that. This is another image of mine. This is, of course, when Job is being smitten with boils. And if you look around, you see the spiders and various tingly things that make you uncomfortable. And for some reason, I wasn't able to upload my pictures directly to Apple Photos, so I had to do many strange things to get them where they are. As I've said, to sort of give you an image about how small they are, these were really meant to be looked at very closely by people. So here you see my hand, and then you see the images on the other side. And I probably should have spun that around, but they are quite small. Which would suggest that Blake intended you to get very close to them. It was intimate reading, as in fact most things with Blake were. He wasn't interested in sort of doing things for humanity in general. He wanted people to get very engaged with his work. He actually mentions this several times, that he finds large paintings to be vulgar, for instance. But with that, so now we've discussed the three editions, and I've given, I hope, what is enough background to really sort of dive in to the meat of what we're going to be talking about tonight. And as with everything else, because I ramble around, we're back on scripts this week. Oh, and I also have a word here that I hope everyone likes. It's serpentine, but it's an inkhorn term that you may find it beneficial one day if you're ever trying to compete with someone on your grammar or your vocabulary. Lepidopteran, so serpent-like. Slithering around Blake's Job sequence, and as I've said, we're using the 1825-26 one, we find a plethora of lepidopteran and reptilian symbolism, which calls out, howling for some analysis. Yet these scaly additions are not only for decorations, but they help Blake convey by degree one of the most central themes in his work, divine alienation, meaning the internal separation of the Godhead from itself. This presentation argues that the serpentine elements of Job's sequence convey important visual representations of the inner life of both Job and the divine figure, the angel of the presence. The serpent is a vital connection in how vision and redemption emerge through Job and the divine figure's encounters with the other, leading to its transformation, meaning the transformation both of the divine and of Job, who is experiencing this. The divine actor of the book of Job, Blake synchronizes with his own mythological figures of Urizen and Nobodaddy, both these sort of negative divine figures of abstraction and deification without humanity or mercy. This is sort of his take on the God of the Hebrew Bible. It's problematic, of course, but there you have it. And the divine figure relies on its encounter with Job to begin its own transformative awareness of both suffering and the roles of others. The serpentine symbolism helps to convey a new way of relating to creation by the divine figure and becomes an external image of its inward reality. I've attempted to present a reading of the Job sequence which interacts with the entirety of Blake's corpus, or at least as much as I could, and to provide a gesture toward a way of understanding the significance of the Job engravings in light of Blake's entire mythological structure and in the context of Blake's religious milieu. It draws furthermore from academic handlings of both Swedish visionary Emanuel Swedenborg and the German theosopher Jakob Böhmer, as well as in the academic study of religion. Although the entirety of Blake's corpus has been gone over with a fine-tooth comb, to the point where scholars despair of saying anything new, the serpentine symbolism seems a rather strange thing to miss, yet many have. Apart from a few paltry mentions here and there, it has escaped the widespread attention I think it deserves. And though under-considered by scholars, this paper contends that the reptilian symbolism of Blake's illustrations bears a particular cosmic significance to his understanding of the fall, which generated the sublunary world, meaning the material world, but also the division of the sexes, and the illusion of the self, his interpretation of Swedenborg's propium. The symbols presented by Blake in his illustrations mirror his mythological perception of a divine contraction and internal alienation, which occurred in eternity, well before Satan's deception of Eve in the garden, and is exemplified, as has been said, by Urizen and Nobodaddy, each an image of the divine being forgetting itself and its connection with others. We start with this reading here, which comes from Vala. The eternal mind bounded, began to roll eddies of wrath ceaselessly round and round, and the sulphurous foam, surging thick, settled a lake bright and shining clear, white as snow, forgetfulness and dumbness, necessity and in chains of the mind locked up, in fetters of ice shrinking, disorganized, rent from eternity. We see here that white is being inverted. Where in traditional Christian symbolism it's considered to be purity, for Blake's idea, it's a form of snowy rationalizing. It's cold and disconnected from life, as he says, rent from eternity. And he thinks that this is, in fact, what Jesus's final goal was to do, was to. Oh, do we have a? Oh, Helen's pointed out here, Lepidoptera is the class of insects, that is butterflies and moths. Well, we'll go back to that later. Thank you for pointing that out. Well, here I am causing issues, causing mischief. Well, thank you. I'll look that up and see if I probably misspelled it, is what I've done. So, Job's story, seen through this vise of the reptilian imagery, becomes a diagnosis of cosmic suffering inflicted by the deity being separated from its true human nature. But also by the book's end, it becomes the promise of redemption. By asserting these connections, it is hoped that the viewer will pay increased attention to the impressive and subterranean narrative present in the illustrations, which play, as it were, a commentary on the primary Job narrative, being deployed under and through the metaphors of the biblical one. So in the first of Blake's prophetic books, the Book of Tyriel from 1789, we find a garden ready planted with the same seeds which will flourish 36 years later with Blake's Job sequence. The Book of Job for Blake was a story of cosmic significance which aligned with his desire to restore eternal vision to both his human brothers and sisters, but also fundamentally to the Godhead itself. In Vala, Blake merges with the prophet Ezekiel to cast down the forces of mystery and pain, and in his Job sequence he shows the inward process by which the core of the divine had lost memory of itself, and in that state became a mockery of its own being and a perpetuator of fundamental cruelty, which is how he understands the wager that God makes with the Satan figure in the story. It is important again to note that this primal transgression again did not occur because of any sin committed by Adam or Eve, but was actually well initiated in eternity, before the creation of the material world, before anything else. And this is very important because in the Job story, there's always two levels. The human level that shows relation is always secondary to what Blake is seeing as a fall that's already occurred within the Godhead. So, and Tyriel, by the way, as we'll talk, is one of these very deluded persons from his story. As the Godhead retracted within itself, this allowed for a process of degradation, which in its finality led to the belief that matter was all that there was, and that this invalid fractured self, the spectre, again what Blake is calling Swedenborg's proprium, was the real person. The spectre is the man, the rest is only delusion and fantasy, it's his quote. The characters of Tyriel, seen here previously, Urizen and Nobodaddy, are each themselves representative of this fractured spiritual state, where ignorance of its former reality believes themselves to be self-sufficient and powerful. We will examine these characters in light of this process described here, and these are the same dynamics which are highlighted in Blake's reading of the Job story and form the major part of the secondary images of the Job sequence, meaning these these marginal images that we see here. And just to point at what I'm saying, we see here that the God figure that's being represented here is being covered in mists and fire, which is, a quote from the book of Exodus. We see Satan here is running forth, and these were the two male and female images that I discussed earlier. Female on the right, female on the left, male on the right. And what Blake is conveying with this is actually in the activities of Satan, in the fallen state, is actually where men and female are divided. And he takes a lot of this from his particular reading of Conjugal Love by Swedenborg. And also in this dark cloud, which we see here, you see the division between the human world and the world of the Godhead, and the open book and the downward pointed fingers, very significant to Blake's entire work. And as we see here, we see a lattice work that's conveying the moment before the fall, when the Almighty was yet with me, when my children were about me, and we see them in the background there. So these are the same dynamics which are highlighted in Blake's reading of the Job story and form the major parts of the secondary marginal images of the Job sequence. However, before going further with analyzing the specifics of the Job sequence's symbolism, a brief word must be said about Blake's understanding of the book of Job in relation to his own thought of the religion of Jesus. William Blake distinguished between the religion of Jesus and the institutional churches of Christ. And this is why it's also very important to keep in mind that the divine figure is not the totality of the divine, as Jesus and the Christ are separated in his mind. So the institutional churches of Christ, and he emphasized a deeply personal, imaginative spirituality over rigid dogma. For Blake, Jesus embodied divine humanity not as a distant doctrinal figure, but as a revolutionary force against oppression and the binding of moral laws, which he finds are hypocritical. Blake famously declared, "All religions are one," suggesting that true faith arises from visionary perception, not imposed creeds. Again, what she takes from Swedenborg. His critique of moral law, particularly in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, aligns with his view of Jesus as a liberator from restrictive commandments. Blake's prophetic works assert that forgiveness and creative freedom are the essence of Jesus' religion, contrasting with legalistic theology, which binds and holds the spirit. I also want to say a very brief, minute particular must be brought forth before considering the book of Job, and that is the book of Job and time in relation to Swedenborg's doctrine of church ages. Because Swedenborg's doctrine played a great deal in helping Blake to conceptualize the Bible and its progressive development as a code of great art. For Swedenborg, the inspired books of the Bible, and you notice he very rarely read anything from Paul, which is very significant, contained in their essence truths about the nature of the universe, and he used Swedenborg's works of correspondences. In the most ancient church, Swedenborg taught, when people still understood all the correspondences in the world, it was possible both to understand one another as well as the mind of heaven. Due to a loss of divine influx, or more specifically due to a clouding of that reality, and through a progressive series of misunderstandings of nature, etc., humankind lost access to this science and fell away from the true faith of God, and began to set up for themselves manifestations of their misunderstandings, which Blake calls idols, and which Blake is actually saying, idol meaning not just a false god, but also a god that takes that which is not owed to them, which Blake actually sees in the God of the Hebrew Bible. Though Blake, as he was wont to do, individualized Swedenborg's concepts and pushed it to its most radical conclusions, much of the logic present in Swedenborg's arguments continue in a variety of imaginative contexts. However, how does knowing about these elements help us to try to understand Blake's reading of the book of Job? And in fact, I would say if you don't understand many of these, as many people in the scholarly community do not, I think that they have only a very simplistic understanding of what's going on in the story of Job. So now that we have any of that, and I think we will stay here just a little bit longer, because I want to talk about this image which we've talked about already. We know it's a spectre, it's an image of the proprium of the Godhead, literally. But there is something that we should also talk about here. What immediately stands out in Blake's Job sequence is the remarkable similarity that exists between the divine figure and Job being directly below him. Were it not for their physical separation denoted by the distance between the heavenly court and its dark trappings, and Job and his wife, you would be hard-pressed to tell them apart. And actually, I've done this before, just taken images and said, who is this? Is this Job or is this God? And they're actually the same image many times. So, in Blake's heretical conception of Swedenborg's idea of divine humanity, this is in fact because both the divine and the human are not mutually exclusive realities but part of a single whole. This is made all the more complicated by Swedenborg's belief that in the person of Jesus, both humanity and divinity were mutually refashioned after the incarnation of Jesus and his victory over death. Fish, who was Harold Fish, was a scholar of Blake. Fish ham-handedly says it like this. According to Blake's radical reading of the gospel, incarnation signifies nothing less than the abolishing of all distinction between man and God. God dissolves in man, and no otherness is left to command us, to question us, or to affright us. Fish, with his discussion of the dissolution, misses, in my opinion, a very key point. It is not that all distinction has disappeared, but in the divine and human interaction, these distinctions no longer make sense to discuss or to be burdened by. They don't disappear, but because the human relation with the divine is so transformative that these distinctions don't make sense anymore in the redeemed view of the work of Jesus, the appearance of the incarnation. Those distinctions don't matter any longer. And Blake leans heavily onto a more expansive and early modern connotation of forgiveness, which is not so much I'm forgiving you for something wrong done to you, but I accept your otherness. And it's this entirely, it tries to turn these concepts on its head. It's not forgiveness in the sense of you've done me wrong, I accept you. No, it's absolute acceptance between God and between the world, which is the core of his message. However, by noticing the physical similarities by Job and the divine figure and marking the distance between them, Blake is pointing to the spiritual and physical isolation that caused the fall in heaven. And this is also displayed, as I've said, in this image. By the way, this is another one from this is, I think, from Vala as well. And I want you to notice the similarity. So you see the satanic figure, which is also a figure who ultimately brings about redemption. You see the same figure here. And then this is my justification about calling the angel of the divine presence as a lesser emanation of the Godhead itself. Okay. So we see both of these things. And now I guess we go on. Yeah. Oh no, sorry. Yeah, I need to go back here. I had to redo these 50 times, so heaven help me what we're doing. So during the feverish activity that surrounds Satan, and we see this over here, by the way, fire is often seen to be illumination in Blake. There are two faces featured in the smoke, the male and female, Satan standing between them. If this scene is showing a contraction of the divine within itself, which is what I argue, then this tableau might illustrate the fall into generation, which Blake bemoans, of male and female, and that true soulmates have been separated, which for Burma, whom Blake read, and I would argue Swedenborg read as well, that was the first sign of the fall, was that you had, another being instead of you were together. In the bottom right-hand corner, and let me put this down because I can't see. So right over here we see in the bottom right, we see the Job's family sitting in front of 3 trees. And on the tree to the furthest right is the first of our little slithery serpentine imagery. We find a serpentine figure which may indicate the passing of the Lord's favor and the process of internalization and judgment. How there is also a promise which foreshadows the restitution which will be made by the end of the work, and the phrasing in the title of the area which says, "We shall wake up in thy likeness." The incompleteness of the divine nature is also emphasized by what Blake chooses to call the divine figure in this engraving the angel of the presence, a phrase which Blake utilized a great many times throughout his work, and which oftentimes denoted a fragmenting of divine essence. As Christopher Rowland also notes in his connection to Old Nobody, is easily inferred here. Why darkness and obscurity in all thy words and laws, that none dare eat the fruit but from the wily serpent's jaws? Or is it because secrecy gains females' loud applause? Which, again, that's a poetic rendering of what he sees as the division. So the spiritual values of things. Furthermore, the image of the angel of the divine presence recalls Urizen as he was portrayed in Vala with his scroll of Hebrew letters. Urizen's forgetfulness and difficulty in accepting the spiritual value of things makes him a legalistic judge without compassion and mindless, many of the same characteristics of the Godhead's activity in Job, according to Blake. To Blake, Job is a victim of habit and lack of awareness, just as the Godhead is a victim of lack of awareness. Blake predicts him as a pious man of the book, righteous in terms of the law, and in that way he reflects the same blindness of the deity to whom he's struggling with. However, this designation for Blake also kinds to a point of hypocrisy, a kind of spiritual essentialism that engenders hypocrisy and self-righteousness. Thus we have a dual image of the dangers of self-righteousness on display in the divine figure and also within Job himself. Of course, Blake's Job is far from an orthodox reading of the text, as Blake interprets Job's continual cries of righteousness to be self-deceptive and isolating, reminiscent again of the Urizen motif, which I'll show you right now, that is an ever-present touchstone in Blake's Job. Blake's Angel of the Presence with his Book of the Law is also a significant figure, as we see here in the Book of Urizen. And Urizen, if you say it slowly, your reason, this is the spectral image. This is the image that is a spectre of the Godhead, and Blake places the creation of the physical world and the lack of spiritual imagination. And Urizen, there is a very important text from this came out in 1794. And if you notice, there's another version of this where Urizen is also surrounded by pillars, which are almost word for word very similar to what's going on in the previous text that the previous image here. But from this, we have this statement. From the depths of dark solitude, from the eternal abode in my holiness, hidden, set apart in my stern counsels, reserved for the days of futurity, I have sought for a joy without pain, for a solid without fluctuation. This deity here, the deity that Blake is saying created this world, is someone who must have personal acknowledgement. He hates change and variation and is a god of dogma, an image, a usurping image that cuts you away from the religion of Jesus in Blake's reading. And even, then we go back here. So even this Los messenger figure also has an early appearance in the Book of Urizen, as I've said. Oh, so that was Urizen, not Vala. Okay, I mixed those. They're very similar images. There's also one in Vala. So this comes, where he is caught mid-stride, the same figure, as in the illustration from plate 4 of the Job sequence. Like the Ophites of old, these were people that thought that the serpent was actually a figure of Jesus who's giving wisdom. Blake saw the potential disruptive transformation that was brought about through the rebellion of Satan, and this is why fire is often significant of inspiration for Blake. And Los, who does his greatest to preserve the original vision, and he connects this with his character of Los, who does the greatest to preserve this original vision of eternity and creation, and stands in stark opposition to the cold and exacting Urizen, whom he wishes to free from his mind-forged manacles. So here's the god that he's rebelling against. This is the satanic rising figure that brings that rebellion. But it's not solely to rebel, it's to It's to speak truth to the very highest echelons of being. This is another image of this, which this is from the further one. But I want you to pay attention. Do you notice the sort of scaliness that's occurring in the leg portion here? The sort of reptilian scales that are forming? This is what Blake is using to talk about in terms of the development of the spectre, the belief in one's own self-existing reality. In plate 3 of the Job sequence, bearing what I've said about the early reptilian possibility of plate 2, the one where you have the little swirl, we see the first presence of indisputable scales here, around the central image of a darkened angel, the angel of the presence, who is thrusting down the pillars on the house of the sons of Job. And these are, by the way, 2 images. So we see right here, he's sending down. This is where Job is starting to be tempted. Next we have, this is the angel who causes the death of Job's children. And we see here an inverted cross, meaning that this is far from the religion of Jesus. We see a lot of spirals, a lot of fire, a lot of danger. We also see the reclining woman, potentially dead or awaiting resurrection. All of this carrying. And notice what Blake says here. The fire of God is fallen from heaven. What do we see over in both of these sides? We see a serpentine image. And this is what I'm talking about. The serpent directly indicates the state of fall in all of this work. So around the central image of the darkened angel, we've seen, now we have the image of the serpentine angel descending from the fire of heaven and going behind the central image. So one of the points that I wanted to make was that this, we don't really know where that extends to. And if you can sort of imagine that each one of these are a vignette about the divine action, the serpent may indeed be going to heaven itself. That's a potential indication. And the tails of these 2 serpents descend from heaven is not accidental in my assessment, nor is the warped holiness of the bat-winged angel of destruction. What is implied here, as with the limitations imposed by the divine figure of Urizen by his own holiness, we see the cruelty of false and inhumane religion. And this is in contradiction with the religion of Jesus, which was the forgiveness of sins, competing with the harsh and inhumane spectre which haunts the earth and brings destruction and pain. And you see there is suffering all around. In consideration, at some instance, it seems like the serpent, or more specifically human beings entwined with the serpent, becomes a symbol of the individual spectre, as we see in the 1795 image, the creation of man by the Elohim, which we see many of the same principles. You see a sort of dead and forgotten figure here who is, there have been those who have argued that it's a form of crucifixion. We again see a spiritual deity that is not looking at the human being, but is hovering above them, is giving reality, but doesn't seem to be giving, the paternal or love aspect that Blake sees in Jesus. And so as we see in the center right image, an image of the inverted figure of the cross, which illustrates how far the Job story was from the revelation of Jesus. Blake repeatedly throughout his life asserted the uniqueness of the Christian story and spoke of the all-embracing nature of the divine humanity, whom he sought his entire life to serve, all beings in fellowship. The religion of Jesus could never become one of domination, he says, but only one of mutual embrace. The glory of Christianity is to conquer by forgiveness. Blake's flirtation with Gnosticism is also well attested in his Laocoon, which we find the image here, where we read, thinking as I do that the creator of this world is a very cruel being, and being a worshipper of Christ, I cannot help saying the Son, oh, how unlike the Father. The conflict between the religion of Jesus and that of Urizen forms the essential conflict in Blake's cosmos, and also, through the overcoming and recombination of these elements, the return to paradise, as Catherine Blake was right to tell us when she said that was Blake's actual home. For further evidence of the Urizen connection to Blake's Job sequence, I would also proffer this image from the book of Urizen from Contrast. So let's look at so we see here an inverted cross. Now we'll follow it over here. We see 3 inverted crosses, reminiscent of the crucifixion image. For contrast, as with the Job image, we find yet again an inverted cross to signify the inversion of true faith, combined with a serpentine image, which might signify both the spiritual state of suffering of Los, who is the character here, but also the potential restoration by the intervention of Jesus. So this is where it ends, but it's not where it has to be. Aside from the relatively positive reception that Blake seemed to share with the Ophite Gnosticism, there is also the famous story from the Hebrew Bible of the brazen serpent, which would provide healing if anyone was bitten by a snake. In Blake's illustration of this event for his friend, the Swedenborgian artist Thomas Butte, he presents the central serpent as a hopeful image, encouraging all to look upwards to heaven and redemption. It is not insignificant that this particular story was dealt with at length by Emanuel Swedenborg, and both Blake and Butte discussed its symbolism at length, and they did this over, I think it was about 6 Sundays. Emanuel Swedenborg interpreted the brazen serpent as a symbol of divine wisdom and spiritual healing. In Arcana Celestia 4211, he explained that the serpent represented regeneration and enlightenment, emphasizing how the Israelites were saved by looking upon it as an act of faith and an acknowledgement of a divine power. In True Christian Religion, he connected the brazen serpent to Christ, arguing that just as the serpent was lifted in the wilderness, so was Christ elevated to offer spiritual healing. He further framed the brazen serpent as a representation of divine perception, showing how individuals must turn towards spiritual inward truth to overcome temptations and falsehood. The ambivalence of the serpentine image is part of what made it so attractive for Blake, as it provides both a symbol of negative change but also of absolute redemption, such as the messianic promise provided in Isaiah 11:18, "And the sucking child shall play on the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the cockatrice's den." That's, of course, the King James image. And we see here on the bottom this ambivalence. You see these little children riding the serpent, the end of the story. Although most of the serpentine elements in Blake's Job sequence seem to point to the more nefarious elements of the story, the context is much more ambivalent in engraving 5. So we have the serpent resting under the central dais. So Satan is gone, as we already discussed. This is an image of the scaliness. This is where we find reptilian symbolism. He's going down into the earth, and yet what do we see wrapped around here? We see angels and, at the bottom, a very pronounced serpent. So we have a serpent resting under the central dais with its eyes firmly locked on Job. The snake unifies the entire engraving, stretching from the divine realm and the upper third of the picture to find its head resting below the charitable Job. With a highly alert eye, fire, trees, limbs, and the tail of the serpent intertwine, and it hints that perhaps the only true redemption lies in seeing these negative symbols anew, as Rowland actually suggests, Christopher Rowland. The text immediately above the serpent's head likewise plays with this ambiguity, as it says, "Who maketh his angels and spirits and ministers a flaming fire." The significance of the upper echelon of the serpent's tail should not be without consideration, as it implies that in some ways the serpent is also sent from the Lord. If the connection, as I have argued for interpreting this image as a form of proprium, holds, then it might be worth stating that the sense of the selfhood is also essential, as Swedenborg says, to the redemptive work And he actually says that you never lose the proprium, even though angels in heaven try very hard to get rid of it. If the connection between Serpent, Spectre, and Swedenborg's idea of proprium holds, then it might be worth stating that the sense of selfhood is essential to the redemptive point. He says this several times, Swedenborg says this several times in his writings, that the proprium becomes a problem only if it is overemphasized or becomes dominant in the internal world. And I can think of no better understanding of Blake's vision of the spectre. So now we go to the next one. Okay, so back again, sorry. As I said, I wrote all these notes and I don't know which way to go. So the serpent is also a witness, if we interpret this here, of false charity, which Blake is often criticizing, which is charity that appears to be good but is not made from the heart or an actual will to help others. The serpent sees this as it's undertaking the scene. As Roland points out, the divine figure who doles out punishment likewise bears the same resentful expression as Job below. You see this image right here, sort of dour, and the image of giving is also dour. Job's wife, furthermore, looks with admiration, as she does, on her husband's doing these good works. And Roland says, the impulse to do good to others in the new life that Job leads after his conversion, when he is open to acts of charity, replaces a sense of external obligation, which is being signified here. Blake was especially critical of this form of self-interested and condescending charity in both his personal life with his patron Charles Augustus Tolkien and his imaginative work, most evidently the poem Holy Thursday from the Songs of Innocence of 1789, where we read, of grey-headed beadles walked before with wands as white as snow, till into the high dome of Paul's they like the Thames water flow. And Blake provides this warning. Now like a mighty wind they raise to heaven the voice of song, or like harmonious thunderings the seat of heaven, among beneath them sit aged men, wise guardians of the poor, then cherish pity, lest you drive an angel from your door. So he's very aware of what he sees as the failure to really love or appreciate others. Personally, and now we go to the 11th engraving, which, as we've already seen, I think is one of the most terrifying in the entirety of Blake's work. It is also one of the most significant. As a major theme in this article has been on understanding how the serpentine imagery conveys cosmological significance in Blake's mythos, and this relies on important themes about transformation, both in the highest sense and in the most personal, along with the realization that this distinction is already proof of a universal fall in the Godhead itself. So after saying all of that and pointing out the image of Elohim creating Adam, some interesting alterations have also taken place in this particular image. In the former piece, this one, oh, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. This has been a theme here. So this image. In the former image, it is the nation Adam who is enraptured by the serpent. His spectre here, and it is with the divine figure itself, is a clue to the power of vision within Blake's retelling. However, unlike Roland, who understands the Job story to be one of personal change, of a self-righteous man meeting God face to face, what we have in the other image, this image here, is exactly the opposite. We see that it is the divine figure who is consumed by the wrath of his isolation and his satanic smirking gaze upon the terrified Job. And this is with dreams on my bed thou scarest me and affrightest me with visions. So this is, in strong contradiction, and it's a direct inversion of the same Elohim principle. The divine figure comes face to face with himself, and we see the similarities here, with the outer expression of his creative drive. Job is the reflection of the inner turmoil, not within himself, but of the Godhead, and the fetters of the limitation that God has placed upon himself, that the angel of the presence have placed upon himself. The serpentine nature of this boastful self-righteousness entwines him, just as the forces of the earth take from within its manacles forged the fires of hell. The snake which surrounds the divine figure has its eyes hungrily on Job, as though it is filling itself with satisfaction at Job's suffering. And this is often how he depicts the God of the Hebrew Bible, who says, there is no one but me, all will bow down. Blake interprets this to be a form of divine violence. So like Urizen, the isolation of his moral power creates a vacuum which likewise wishes to imprison all life that is uncontrolled or organic. This isolation paradoxically builds a desire to expand, to build and to conquer. In Urizen, the first thing that the emerging terror does is to busy himself with measuring the abyss. And I know all of you have seen that image, which I did not include for some reason. The image of the figure, the white-bearded figure, measuring the world with a compass. But you see that image. So dark, revolving and silent activity, unseen in tormenting passions, an activity unknown and horrible, a self-contemplating shadow in enormous labors occupied. That's how he reads a lot of the Hebrew Bible, as this is God's self-elevation, and this betrays the fact that it's not the real, deity. His isolation creates in Urizen a hunger for total power and recognition that he alone is the only being from eternity. A point, as Blake astutely points out, betrays the uncertainty of this figure. Much of the vacuous nature of Urizen Blake borrows from Boehmer's conception of God the Father. Boehmer's Trinity begins in the absolute turbid hunger and aloneness of the divine, which wishes above all else to manifest itself in love and in diversity, a consuming fire that can only be approached through mediation of God the Son, the Spirit of life. Without the mediation of the Son, the entire cosmos would be consumed by God's absolute justice and burn away. But Blake adds to this, seeing this primary aloneness as being one of self-imposed imposed exile and the obliteration of otherness, not a primal reality. Hence is why he portrays the God of Genesis as a bragger and a boaster. When the divine encounters the other, it becomes mediated within itself. And as Job grows in his awareness of his nature and loses the specters of his own self-righteousness and his own independence, both he and the divine figure expand and give each other the space to be, as is reflected in the next plate, which is, this is the famous God answered Job out of a whirlwind. The windswept hair of both Job and the divine figure seems to imply that the wind was figurative in not only Job's change, but in the divine itself. If you look at the other figure, there's no hair flying, it's only in Job. Shorn from its isolation, the divine figure might actually be called, in this case, the father of Jesus, as he seeks to reorder the world, as is further shown by plate 14, which is, of course, my favorite. And this, I think, is the representation. This is not the final, but this is a representation of the moment of change, when you see the divine figure being put in the middle between absolute eternity, the forces of light and darkness, and the material world. So this is a point of order. It's a tipping point that will change the nature of the Godhead from this moment on. The final plates to be considered in this study, while not mirror images of one another, are nonetheless connected, as pristine representations of the hope of completeness and the redemption of the world. After Job has been answered by the divine figure out of the whirlwind, and the two beings are put face to face, again with one another, a mutual identification takes place, which leads to the reapproximation of both Job and his Lord, and each's place in the universe. This is the moment that the morning stars sang together and all the sons of gods shouted together. And though it is not a complete redemption, it is rather the beginning of a redemptive process, as for the first time the divine itself seeks to know and to be concerned with the plight and existence of others. and this begins the process of renewing the creation of the world and allowing the Godhead itself to be redeemed through the intervention of human consciousness and understanding. This plate is a microcosmic illustration of how Blake understood the physical redemption, not as a prison of darkness, but rather as the end point for a feat of cosmic redemption, which would involve the divine being humanized through the incarnation of the Lord, in Blake's unique take on Swedenborg's incarnational theology. To begin our analysis of plate 14, with the motto of at the top of the figure, "Canst thou bind the sweet influences of Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion?" Job 38:31. This quote comes from Job's encounter with the Lord in the whirlwind, but appears at first to be a show of power. But what it appears at first to be a show of power, we see becomes a model of self-reflection and a new approximation. Thus, on the margins of the engravings, we have an entire recounting of the 7-day creation of the world. It is important once again to underscore that for Blake, the original fall was not the fall of Adam and Eve, but rather one of God being alienated from himself, with the material world being one of redemptive potential and not one of sin or destruction. As we find in Vala, Night 7, "Then those in great eternity met in the council of God as one man. For contracting their exaltedness into the limits of opacity, they called it benevolence." And this is Blake's eternal thing, that there is nothing wrong with the world. The world is itself the way of redemption. This theme repeatedly appears in Blake's corpus, where even in the Book of Thel, his first work, we have a statement about the great responsibility and hope of material form. In the story of Matron Clay, a symbol of physicality, she recalls her great work in the process of redemption. This is, by the way, I think one of the most beautiful texts in his work. "The clod of clay heard the worm's voice and raised her pitying head. She bowed over the weeping infant and her life exalted. In milky fondness, then on Thel she fixed her humbled eyes. O beauty of the vale of Hars, we live not for ourselves. Thou seest me, the meanest thing, and so I am indeed, but he that loves the lowly pours oil upon my head and kisses me, and binds his nuptial bands around my breast, and says, Thou mother of my children, I have loved thee, and I have given thee a crown that none can take away. But how this is, sweet maid, I know not, and I cannot know. I ponder, and I cannot ponder, yet I live and love." Given the jubilant title of the plate, the only real jubilation takes place in the upper section of the plate, where we see human figures celebrating. If my contention that the cause for celebration was the awakening of self-understanding within the Godhead as what's being depicted, then in the anthropomorphism of the figures, it should also be highlighted in light of this. For Swedenborg, everything in the universe is a reflection of the complete union between humanity and divinity accomplished by the incarnation of the Lord Jesus. Thus, at its core, all things have an intrinsic humanity. It is the reclamation of this humanity in the realm of the physical that both the poet and the artist achieve in their highest works, and it is fully on display here. In Rain's analysis of Blake's Thel, she makes the argument that Blake drew from Swedenborg's understanding of the universal humanness of all things. He definitely did in this story, and in particular from True Christian Religion, where he discusses the relatability of human processes to even the most minute things, such as mold. This is a quote from Swedenborg. "The internal of a particle of mold, whereby its external is impelled, is its tendency to make the seeds of plants vegetate, exalting somewhat from its little bosom, which insinuates itself into the innermost part of seeds, and produces this wonderful effect, meaning growth." In the minutiae of the world, Blake wanted to celebrate the fullness of the divine expression and present even the most base elements as being capable of expressing joy at divine vision. In Vala, we have animals which were typically thought of in Blake's day as being vermin, being caught up in rapture close to the forges of Louvain, as well as the possibilities of dust in the millennium, shouting forth their joy. "The cloud that rose in the valley shall bring forth the sun, and every grain of dust shall shine forth in joy," Blake prophesies. Thus, the figure here seems to forecast this humanization taking place within the Godhead. And we're not so far away now, people. So we're at the end. We're getting close. Image 21. In plate 16, the divine figure does not appear as a single entity, but is surrounded in the highest heaven by a court of divine beings. And together they watch Satan as is cast out from the divine presence. You notice, together they realize that the spectre is not themselves. This is the point, that the divine figure is being surrounded, and in the mediation of others, he realizes cruelty and pain and rejects it. The spectre, another quote from Milton, and the spectre is the reasoning power in man, and when separated from imagination, enclosing itself as in steel, in the ratio of the things of memory, it thence frames laws and morality. With this hardened image of self-righteousness, the divine can converse with and bless humankind. The most powerful image of this, of course, is plate 17, as we see here, where the divine descends, the next one, where the divine descends to bless Job and his wife with an interesting choice. Given the traditional depiction of Job's wife, who's, by the way, she's the one who's often seen as being damned, because she says, curse God and die. And she's sort of the image that a lot of people have of the failure of Job's wife. But in this story, he's blessing both, which I think is very interesting. In seeing not only with the eyes, but with the shared vision of human relations, Blake and the divine are finally able to understand one another and join in a reunion which promises redemption. Take note of how the divine figure stands and the Job figures, again, they have the same countenance, the same face. And the three friends of Job, his comforters we see here, who used rational argumentation to prove a trite moralism, are each turned against the light, which Job and his wife alone endure. God actually commands Job to sacrifice, or he says that all three of his comforters will be killed. So that's a very important thing to remember. And then, so this is not the final image in the Job sequence. It is, for me, some of the most powerful because it relates to this one. This is the final image in the series that's not the end, and it is the direct descent of this. And especially take note of how the books are open, but no one is reading them. Now we're going into an entirely different perspective, where we see Job is internalizing the divine. There is no distinction here. There's no divine figure, there's no angelic figure. But what there is Job recounting his life, and they exist in unison behind him. Paint also close attention to the serpentine images here as well. But now, instead of being a serpent that attacks or conceals, it stands behind. In the presence of his loving daughters, Blake's Job takes on the symbolic cross-like posture of a divine figure. As he looks down upon the daughters, presenting the many stories of his encounters with God, in the vignettes behind him, scenes taken from the events of the Job story, conveyed in particular his affection, and he stands as the representative of a primal theosophical revelation which has reintegrated the human in its totality. And this has emerged to encounter God more thoroughly, more human, and actually embodied than he ever was before. The spectral images behind him and the lack of the divine figure also point to a mutual absorption. The divine image in Job, and as his motto of the text suggests, a mutual spiritual alacrity between Job and the mind of God. How precious are thy thoughts unto me, O God! How great is the sum of them! The notion of sum takes on a special value in the context of Blake's mythos, as it accounts for an infinite variety of experiences which are part of the totality of the human divine experience. And that to see things in only one way is the road of tyranny and despotic jealousy. Throughout Blake's entire opus, there remains a continual concern for the oppression of singularity. As he wrote to Butts, "May God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep." He thought that physicality, that Newton's depiction of matter was particularly heinous because it robbed what he saw as the continual divine essence. Now, there are many quotations which Blake uses to give this concern, but none is greater than his quote from Proverbs of Hell, where he says, "A fool sees not the same tree that a wise man sees." This ability to learn to see as others see is the ability to merge and connect with other souls. As we see of the ancients in the prophetic books, in our mental realm we can merge even with the Lord himself, as he is not a God afar off, but is the mighty friend of sinners. Belated between the two rows of images, we see a group of encircling serpents, each with a soft smile. I believe, and I must confess complete conjecture, that these may be the wise serpents referenced in the Bible, and there is some reason to say so, and which convey at the moment Job sees with his divine eye, and is a living and fruitful image of one who has known and wrestled with God. Perhaps Blake is saying, as I argue, that the difference between heaven and hell is a difference of the state of seeing, which I think is very much in keeping with Swedenborg. And the quote from 139, which we find in the bottom here, Psalm 139, "If I ascend up to heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there also." Blake continued this image about divine vision throughout when he offers this quote, "When it will be questioned when the sun rises, do you not see a round disk of fire, somewhat like a guinea? Oh no, I see an innumerable company of the heavenly host, crying, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. I question not my corporeal or vegetative eye, more than I would question a window concerning a sight. I look through it and not with it." And I tried to keep all of Blake's pronunciations and spellings, so he doesn't use a lot of punctuation. So, in all of this, what might we do with this image? What does this speak to us? And for this, I have a quote from Suzanne Sklar's book on Jerusalem, where she shows that what Blake tries to do with his images is to directly bring the reader in as a form of almost divine theater. So, and she uses this image divine theater, and it seeks to change us and the world around us. It has what might be called a moral imperative. Because visionary in theater invites imaginative participation, it is an appropriate way of regarding a text that explicitly seeks to create transformation. Jerusalem's audience, and I would say the audience who are seeing the book of Job, is implicated in the action of the poem or the pictures we see. Blake addresses his audience directly, both in each chapter's preface, and he continually invites the reader to do this in their interpretation of the symbols, as well as in the body of the text. He wants us to build Jerusalem, to create societies in which forgiveness or total acceptance is a social structuring principle. As we end, I think that very many people have looked at the Job stories. Many people have tried to interpret all of the different elements that come together, but it seems as though even after, over 100 years, well over a century, people are still struggling to acknowledge this sort of transformative element that to me is the very central of what these stories convey. Many people try to read them as just a new take on the Job story, etc. But I think that really what he wanted you to do is he wanted you to go on your own experience with God and to reconnect beyond the sort of false modalities that was given by the old church. And in that, I consider him the most, this is, in my opinion, his most Swedenborgian project, maybe after Jerusalem itself. I leave with just this last quote, and I think that this sort of, it depicts what his vision of a redeemed human being may look like. "I feel that a man may be happy in this world, and I know that this world is a world of imagination and vision. The tree which moves some to tears of joy is in the eyes of others only a green thing that stands in the way. Some see nature all ridicule and deformity, and by these I shall not regulate my proportions. And some scarce see nature at all. But to the eyes of the man of the imagination, nature is imagination itself. As a man is, so he sees. As the eye is formed, such are its powers. You certainly mistake when you say that the visions of fancy are not to be found in this world. To me, this world is all one continued vision of fancy or imagination, and I feel flattered when I am told so. So I cannot express really, and I realized maybe that when I was going through this, it's really dense. But so far, everybody has been pretty receptive to dense things. So that's what I have for you. And let's come back together. We'll stop recording